acquired by Facebook in like the first 2 years of their. So that's Alberto.
Thank you very much. So just one thing. So Facebook did not technically acquire it. It's these kind of things. So my name is Alberto, and I'm going to present you today replay attacks and defenses against cross-shard consensus in sharded distributed ledgers. So this is joint work. Well, I'll just go like that. So this is joint work with Bano, Mustafa, and George. So we did the entire work when we were at UCL and at ChainSpace. But so now we joined Calibra. And Calibra asked us to make clear that this was work done previously with joint, but still add at least one slide about Calibra. So here you go. That's the slide. So I removed a lot of introductions about what are blockchains, why we're so happy to have them, what are the good things we can do with that, because I assume that you kind of know about that. And same for all the discussions about, BFT consensus, bad nodes, we should have 4, we should not have 3, because all of that has also been discussed. So we will have either a bit more time for me to go to the implementations of the protocol, or for you to crucify me a bit more with your questions, depending on what you enjoyed the most. So here is the problem of blockchain scalability. We imagine that we have those nodes, and they run consensus, right? If we have PBFT, the communication complexity would be 1 squared. I mean, in the happy case, hot stuff tell us, you can do better than that, you can do n. Okay, but if we had a lot of nodes, the more nodes we add, and the slowest it gets. So there are a lot of works around scalabilities and many ways to try to scale a little bit more those consensus protocols, right? So several approaches, sharding, so that's the one that we're focusing right now, but there are many others, right? So these are just not included in the talk. So people may say, well, we just live a happy life off-chain, have state channels, and if things go bad, well, we'll use just the main chain as the supreme court to settle our disputes and just to commit things from time to time. Or, I mean, whatever idea, like bigger blocks, smaller blocks, all of these can be played to increase throughput or whatever. So, particularly about sharding, this is the setting that we're working on right now for this talk. So we have lots of nodes, some of them are bad, and what we do is that we separate into subset of shards all those nodes. So we may use run hound, run herds, random allocations, and so you see that here we were finally happy because the bad nodes are not all in one shard. So maybe David will not be happy with that assumption, but let's say this is the setting where we're working right now. So every shard is honest, and the bad nodes are fairly split among those shards. So how does it work? So every shard will run internally its own consensus protocol. It's one state. So everybody here has a same view of, let's say, UTXO model. But still, every shard only is concerned about the object or the unspent output of its own quorum. So everybody would grow its own chain, so every piece of chain together would still represent a single shard, a single state. But at some points, the separation is not perfectly clean because you may want to use some output objects that are on one shard, some others that are on the other shard, and those shards would need to communicate with each other. And that's where all the work in cross-shards protocol starts. So this is just a quick reminder of how this should work. Let's say that we have a transaction T that takes 2 inputs, x1 that lives on shard 1, and x2 that lives on shard 2. So shard 2 is not aware of x1, and shard 1 is not aware of x2. And the transaction needs to happen in some way that x1 and x2 get consumed, and the output objects appears on y1, y2, and y3, respectively on each shard. Okay, this is an example of transaction. So there are a lot of bad things that could happen, so only 2 possible outcomes that are correct, as we had. So yesterday, it's either the transaction does not happen, and so we have x1 and x2, or the transaction does happen. We don't have x1, we don't have x2, but we have all the output. Whatever other combination is not okay. So I'll move the slide about that because it's about the same of what was said yesterday. So Here, so we have some attacks on some of the cross-shard consensus protocol, which are actually fairly new. So these attacks allow to double spend resources, or sometimes, depending on the system that you're running, if it's a smart contract platform or not, you may be able to lock some resources. And it's a kind of a weak adversary in the sense that it doesn't need to collude with any node. It can act as a client, but sometimes it can even be a passive observer and just observe what's in the blockchain. And it has the ability to manipulate the network. So the network is his friend. It can delay messages, reorder messages, and all these kind of things. So first I need to say, those attacks are very, very easy to fix if you say, look, I add a synchrony assumption for safety. But as the first speaker said yesterday, this would be disgusting. And the second way that you could easily fix those attacks is to say, well, we require shards to actually store additional states, so not only the UTXO, but also some information about the old state, and also some specific protocol messages that needs to come. And every time that they receive a cross-shard transaction, well, they would need to go through the old state and make sure that it's not a double spend. So, but since the only point of sharding is increasing scalability, I guess that this would be probably even worse than disgusting. So let's try to have a solution that doesn't include those two. So we illustrate our attacks in the vanilla implementation of chain spaces OmniLedger. So this could also be applied to other vanilla implementation of other systems, but these are the two we know best, and we have the authors in the room, so I mean, it's always more fun. Let's see how it goes. So first, a quick reminder of the cross-shard protocol of chain space. So this is how it works. We take the same transaction T as before. So x1 lives on shard 1, and x2 lives on shard 2, right? The client submits the transaction to shard 1 and shard 2, because they're the two shards that actually know about the objects. Okay, they run BFT internally, and they make the decision, is that object okay? Does it exist? I'm sequencing that with all other transactions that I may have. And at some point, what they do, if they decide that actually it should go through, they lock x1, so shard 1 locks x1, shard 2 locks x2, and they send to each other a pre-accept T message. Okay, the message goes through, reaches the shards. Shard 1 realizes that shard 2 said pre-accept, that himself is said pre-accept. And then he says, okay, that's good for me. So what I do is I delete x1, and I create y1. Shard 2 says the same, so it deletes x2 and creates y2. And then what they do is they send a message to the client by saying, look, it's an accept, all good. And also to shard 3 by saying, it's fine to me, you can create y3. And this is how it happens. So you can see that this is actually a two-phase commit protocol that works, again, under the assumption that every shard in itself is honest and always live. So this protocol has liveness also because of that reason. So we may have bad nodes inside shards, but overall, the shard is honest. That's why the pre-accepts come from the shard, right? Okay, and so now depending on which messages you take and which messages you replay, you can have all sorts of bad behavior that happens if you just follow this protocol like that. So I'm not expecting you to read that table. I'm just taking one of the examples there, which is some of them are actually very similar, and walk you through to see how it goes. So we take that example. So x1 is 10 coin, x2 is 5 coin, and they want to make that transaction that recreates those coins, shard 1, shard 2, and shard 3. So we can say that's a very simple smart contract, the coin smart contract that just needs to make sure, well, the sum of the input equals the sum of the output. Yeah, it's the case. And the goal of the attacker now is to, in the first phase, trying to record a pre-accept T message from shard 1. The attack works in two phases. First, it records a message, and then, during another instance of the protocol, it replays the message at a very particular time, exploiting a race condition. So first thing that the client does, it computes a bad transaction, bad in the sense that it knows that this cannot go through. So what it does is it takes, okay, T prime, and input x1 tilde that is supposedly to be lived on shard 1, but actually does not exist. So it knows in advance that this will fail. And it puts x2 on the input, so of the same x2 as the real transaction, and takes the output on that way. So okay, submits that T prime transaction. Obviously, shard 1 says pre-abort, so this is not okay. x1 tilde does not exist. And shard2 says, fine, x2 exists, so I send a pre-accept. So which means that shard2 now locks the object x2. But the attacker has the capability of kind of stopping time here, because he can manipulate the network, and says, all right, this protocol is now stalled for a little time. And what it does is it sends transaction T, so the one of before, the target transaction. So what will happen is shard1 would say pre-accept, that's good for me, x1 exists actually. But shard2, we say, no, sorry, x2 is currently locked. So for me, that's an abort right now. So it means that fine, the protocol aborts, nothing happened. But now the attacker could record the message pre-accept T sent by shard1. Then the first protocol then resumes, and okay, it aborts, so x2 gets unlocked. And that's fine, nothing happens. So nothing happens, but the attacker managed to record the pre-accept T from shard1. Now what the attacker does is it sends another transaction, T star, that says, fine, we'll just take x1 and spend it to some other shard or to the same shard, whatever. But now the input doesn't exist anymore. Maybe transfer just the coin to another account he owns. And now he can send the transaction T. So what he does is, again, to shard1 and to shard2. Shard1 says, well, x1 does not exist because you just spend UTXO, right? So you just used your x1. And shard2 says, well, that's good to me because I didn't spend it yet, so I can send a pre-accept. But now, what happens is the attacker races shard1 by sending the pre-recorded accept T to shard2. So this is not assuming synchrony. So what will happen is shard2 says, well, that's the first message that I received from shard1, so I make progress because myself has said pre-accepts. So what will happen is they would delete x2, create y2, send a message to the client by saying that's okay. Sure, shard1 abort because it reminds its own decision that was saying pre-abort. But still, shard3 may receive, depending on which arrow he arrives first, y3. And so what happens is we spend 5 coins to create 14 coins in that example, which is bad, generally. So these attacks also work on the second phase of the atomic commit protocol, but they're much less interesting. It's just that it's a bit unclear what happens if those messages here are repeated in the very specific scenario where Sharded 3 was not part of the first phase of the atomic commit protocol before. But those are not interesting, so I'm just skipping that. Okay, and this is OmniLedger, which is very similar. So those two works have been done more or less at the same time. So people were aware of each other when the paper were basically already written. So the protocols are very similar, but in the sense that now, in OmniLedger, the client acts as coordinator. So it's not that shard1 and shard2 would send messages to each other. They would just channel those messages to the client. And that gives much better performance at chain space in the sense that they are linear in the number of shards. So what happens? Chain space, OmniLedger doesn't really have a concept of locking. What it does is that they optimistically invalidate, and if necessary, they would revalidate the object later. So send the transaction as before, transaction T. Shard1 gets that, shard2 gets 2. They both inactivate x1 and x2. Fine. They send pre-accept to the client. Client aggregates those messages and repeats back it's an accept because everybody sent pre-accept. So I didn't mention, but if any of the shards would say pre-abort, well, they would just send abort, right? That's also the case for OmniLedger, for chain space. And so that, again, can be seen as a two-phase commit protocol. So again, if you replace some of the messages, you may see some kind of bad behavior, but I just take one and go much faster than before with the same transaction to show that exactly the same thing may happen in that scenario, right? So again, we want to record pre-accept T from shard1. We submit the same batch transaction as before. So the goal of that transaction is just to trigger some specific messages from the shards, right? And just to record that. So we send T prime, okay, we delay now. We repeat the protocol by saying the transaction T exactly as before. X2 gets invalidated, but again, the attacker can record pre-accept T from shard1. the protocol says aborts, so all the protocol aborts, but this is exactly as before. Actually, the only difference is that since the messages are channeled to the client, well, you get better complexity, but at the end of the day, the same attack happens to both. Now again, you remove your X1 in order to be able to double spend the other coins. You create the first instance of the protocol, and then you raise to the client with your pre-recorded pre-accept key, which will then aggregate all the messages and reflect back. So now I have to say it makes little sense for an adversary which is not the client to attack OmniLedger in that context. Because, I mean, if you have a very kind adversary that wants to help the client to make more money, this can also work, because now we're just double spending the client's coins. But generally speaking, the attacker would be the client itself in that scenario. So again, also attacks against the second phase, it's a bit unclear what happens if those messages get replayed multiple times. It's not very easy, at least not trivial to implement for counter and nonces, since as chain space, no one really knows the state of the other shards. So okay, the two issues here, so I'm not going to the full details, just saying quickly what are the things that causes the problem. By the way, I'm seeing no questions, so is that normal? Yes?
I was wondering, since you asked for questions, here's a question.
Yeah.
So I was wondering then, two-phase commit works, right? Two-phase commit normally works.
Yes.
And the state machine replication paradigm also works.
Yes.
So you can replace a single process by a replicated thing. So what's wrong here? The two-phase commit implemented in those protocols?
It's exactly that side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah. So what are the things indeed that makes this attack work? Despite all the primitive in itself are actually very nice. It's just that when you compose them, well, they're bad and good ways to compose them. But that's what happened. So basically, the problem is the input shard cannot associate the protocol messages, so the two-phase atomic commit messages, to the instance of the protocol, of the cross-shard protocol. So they cannot really know if a replayed message comes from the current instance of the protocol or from an old one that has just been happening in parallel. So the problem happens at the composition of those primitives. It's not a problem of any of those two primitives per se. And the second is that the output shards, which is a thing that probably doesn't happen in classic two-phase atomic commit, some output shards do not take parts of the first phase of the protocol. They only take part of the second one. It's just that they receive a message from the input shard by saying, look, you were not part of the input shard because the input object were not your concern, but we're telling you, you should create a new object here. And so generally speaking, two-phase atomic commit says, I mean, you do the first phase and you do the second phase. But here we have some players that actually do only the second phase, but not the first phase. And this creates a concern when you breach the primitives. It's a high-level explanation. Is that a little bit what you were hoping for? Yeah.
Well, it's like often in crypto that some session identifiers were missing. Eh?
Exactly, yeah. So exactly. So the thing why it's not very easy to add a session identifier, I mean, we did it, so it's not impossible, but it's not trivial to do, is because the shards cannot know anything about the other shards. So you cannot have a global session identifier for your transaction, because otherwise it implies that you actually know the state of the others, and it's not really state sharding anymore. But we can indeed add session identifiers, yeah, in such a way that we don't want to break scalability neither. So what we did is we fixed the problem, but since we were so nicely in that way, we just said, look, let's have a protocol that a little bit combines OmniLedger and chain space and fix it at the same time, because OmniLedger got better performance, but it's actually slightly easier to fix chain space, and since they're very similar, we might as well have a new one. And we call it Biscuit.
Biscuit.
Yeah, Biscuit. Yeah. So the name is fairly random, but as any respectable French-speaking person, I cannot pronounce Biscuit. So I pronounce it Biscuit, and so George said one day, well, look, it's Byzantine, so we might as well change a few letters. That's the origin of the name. So we fix first the issue 1 of the slide before, and then the issue 2. So as you mentioned, the issue 1, we add some session identifiers here. How do we do that? So we add a sequence number to each object. So not to each shard, we tried, but I mean, we didn't find any obvious solution to make it that way, would have been better. But every object in itself. So this, of course, means the objects are a bit bigger, but I mean, it's a sequence number after all. So every time that you store an object, you also store an associated sequence number. Starts with 0. Now, what you do is that to fix issue 2, the fact that you have only some output shards do not take part of the first phase of the atomic commit protocol, we says, look, we'll fix it in a kind of trivial way. We force every output shard to also be part of the input shard, so they will follow all phases of the atomic commit protocol. So if you have the transaction T that only was touching input x1 and input x2, we say, all right, since the output is also on shard 3, we will have a dummy object that will be inserted in the transaction just for the sake of making the protocol progress the same for every shard. So when you bootstrap a shard, it creates a fixed number of dummy objects, which also have sequence numbers. And well, when you send the transaction T, I will show you in a second, it will also touch one of the dummy objects of the shard that then will be recreated. So now, to send a transaction T, the client we also act a little bit like coordinator, taking inspiration from OmniLedger, by saying it proposes the next sequence number for all the objects that will be touched by the protocol. So it's ST there. So what it does is it sends the transaction to all shards, so also shard 3 this time. Then they do two things. They do the usual checks. So UTXO is all fine, the input is there, we should go ahead. But they also check, so each one does that check, that the proposed sequence number is actually bigger than the sequence number of their own object. So this is a bit misleading, this formula there, because actually shard 1 doesn't know the SX2. It only knows the sequence number of its own object. So everybody individually would just check that ST is bigger than its current sequence number. And everybody does that. They just check that it's big or equal because they have no idea of if the sequence number of other people would actually be bigger. And if the protocol fails, so if anybody needs to say abort, well, in any cases, you update the sequence number. So you update it to ST plus 1, not just to plus 1. Otherwise, there are still replay attack possible. And this forces the sequence number to be monotonically increasing. And since you cannot go back with those sequence numbers, well, then it means that, intuitively it means that you cannot really replay the internal messages, and you can use those sequence number as session identifier. And that's the classic way of fixing the replay attacks. So we have a theorem proof, but this is probably better to explain that way. So what you do is, as usual, you lock x1. So shard 1 locks x1, shard 2 locks x2, and shard 3 locks its dummy objects, so because it needs to lock an input as well. And what they do, they don't simply say, all right, those objects are locked, but they lock by saving ST and T, the transaction, as a pair. So they know that now those objects are not only locked in general, but they're locked for that particular instance of the protocol. And this is what acts as session identifier. So now, this is the little difference that we have with respect to chain space and OmniLedger, which is kind of similar in the same way. Actually, it's, chain space says you send the pre-accept messages to all the other messages. OmniLedger says, well, you can send it to the client. To the client, it will aggregate and will be more efficient. The thing is, it makes total sense to rely on the client to do this aggregation if you only have coins in your system. Because we may say, sure, the client has some incentive to make the protocol progress and, for its own transaction at the very least, because he's the one that wants to spend its own coin. But it's not specifically true, or at least it's not obvious to me, if that's the case if you have a general smart contract platform. In the sense, imagine that you have an object that is a debt and not really a coin. You may want to not make the protocol progress, right? So we say we have an external party. We call it TM, the transaction manager. I'll come to that in a minute to see who is actually that TM, that will act as the OmniLedger client, aggregate, and send back the messages. So what do the output shards do? Well, if everything goes through, they first need to check that indeed they lock the transaction for that particular pair of ST and T, and then they delete the inputs, and they create the output. And note that about the dummy object, you also delete it, and since it was a dummy object, you recreate a new one, because you always want a fixed supply of dummy objects. So there is a little detail that I'm overlooking here, is that these domain objects, at the end of the day, limit your concurrency a little bit, because you can have a fixed supply, can be big, sure, but this is still the maximum number of transactions that the shard could handle at the same time. So this is also a two-phase atomic commit, just composed a little bit better. And so who is that TM now? Well, this is an insight that comes from the OmniLedger paper, which is probably, maybe it has not been emphasized enough, but actually these guys repeated us a few times before that, is to say, look, actually, it doesn't really matter who aggregates the message and who acts as TM, because it doesn't act on any secret. It's actually an operation that sees some messages, signed, you don't need to use any secret on your own, you just aggregate and send it back to the right people, right? So it means that this TM can actually be anybody. We may say, let's say that it's one single party, and if that party does not make progress, where we hope that one honest good Samaritan in the system will come, pick up, realize that the protocol has not completed, and complete the protocol on its behalf. Or we might say, look, we pick a shard, we choose a shard, and what we do is we select a certain number of nodes, or maybe one node in the shard, and we try to use him as a TM. If it doesn't work, we pick the next one, and so the next one. And eventually, we'll pick the F+1, and that node should be good and should allow the TM to make progress. But, I mean, those are all possibilities, not really important. We know that in any case, under potential different assumption, we will make progress in the protocol. And so how does this prevent replace attacks? So as I said before, the problem was input shard cannot associate protocol messages to the specific instance. Well, now the session ID solves that problem. That's very classic in the literature. And the second problem, that output shard do not experience the full two-phase atomic commit, but just the second phase. Well, now we force them to participate in the first phase, so there is no attack surface in that way anymore. So yeah, the code is open source. Now I can either go slightly to the performance, or I'm over time, so I don't know.
So you started late, so it would be great if you stop and do 2-3 minutes of Q&A.
Yeah.
Questions for Roberto?
Yeah.
So maybe something I missed. So how do you ensure that every committee has, or every shard has, honest majority or honest 2/3?
Yeah, that's the setting in which it's the setting in which we work and in which OmniLedger and ChainSpace work, basically. That's, I mean, it's an assumption. That's how it goes.
So the total amount of adversary would be much lower than usual.
Sorry?
So the total amount of adversary that you tolerate would be much lower than usual.
Yeah. I mean, the best description on this, it's actually on the beginning of the OmniLedger paper that basically says, this is the number of nodes that you have. You use distributed randomness. That's how you attribute nodes to shards. And that number of nodes that you need in order to have, I mean, good probability for these things that you mentioned do not happen. But here, it's an assumption. We work under that assumption, and that's it.